Okay, folks. So, decided to go ahead and redo this lecture on Chapter 4 for some various reasons. And so, Chapter 4 in this JavaScript textbook deals with JavaScript objects, functions, and events. And so, what's kind of interesting about this chapter is that we've been working with JavaScript objects, JavaScript functions, and events already. Like we've already been working with all of these things, and now we're just going to dive a little bit deeper, right? So we've all created functions. Hopefully we understand what a function is. It's just a block of code that you can call that block of code, so that block of code executes when an event occurs. An event is something that's interesting to the software, right? What I mean by interesting to the software, that's really vague. But what I mean by that is anything can be an event. Literally anything that happens to the page or that the user does. Whether you move the mouse, you click the key, time goes by. I mean, there's so many different ways to assess what an event is. So you could just say it's something interesting to the software that causes something else to happen. So an event is just an interaction of some sort, something interesting. And then JavaScript objects, these are a lot of the built-in things in JavaScript that we have to work with. So a lot of basically the built-in code built into JavaScript, in these things called objects. And what are these objects that have methods? And so basically this is how we learn to write a lot of the basic JavaScript that's just built in for us to work with. And so what are the built-in things that we can work with, the built-in JavaScript objects? And so we get into some of these objects being window, document, text box, number, date, and string. How these things are created, some of the different methods they have, like parse int and parse float. You might not realize that you've been using them, but where do those come from? There are some various selectors that we haven't learned yet. Right now, we know document get element by ID, and that's our selector, but they do introduce some different selectors in this chapter. Again, when we learn about the various objects and like the text box object, what is a text box object? Well, here's the way you've used a text box object. When you've targeted a text box in your JavaScript, you've used this value property, right? On your last test, you use the value property of a text box to read information out of a text box in your HTML. So you've used these things in ways, and now, again, we're just kind of expanding our knowledge on that. There's a method called TwoFixed that's going to round to a certain number of decimal places. We've used that. We'll work with dates in JavaScript, which we haven't done a lot of that. When we're working with dates, a lot of the different methods that can kind of help us with that. We'll work more with strings. And so when you're working with data, a string is just a combination of letters, characters, numbers. And so there's just a bunch of built-in JavaScript methods to work with strings. And so working with strings, when you're working with a lot of information, these are very common things that you need to do when you're working with data. If you get capital letters, you might want to convert it to all lowercase. You might want to just, if you've got a long string, you might just want a portion of the string. So you've got substring. And so you've got these different methods to say, okay, I've got this string that's 100 characters long, but I'm only interested in the first 10 characters. And so you substring it, right? So these are just very common functions, whether you're writing JavaScript or any language. When you're working with data, these are common functions that you do with data. There's some different ways to create functions. Arrow functions being kind of the most common and standard way. So I'll focus in a little bit on arrow functions because that's what's new in this version, and that's kind of the accepted standard now for how to write functions. And then again, a little bit between these different ways, function declarations versus function expressions. Hopefully you guys kind of saw in my last video the different ways to create functions. The one new one, again, is what I'm going to focus on here, arrow functions. And then this idea of scope, global scope, local scope, and block scope. And so this concept of scope is a newer concept to this chapter, so that is new. Let's see. Describe how to create and attach event handlers, and describe the current target property and prevent default method of the event object. So these are all objectives that we will cover. All right. So going through this slide kind of quick, these are some of the typical objects that JavaScript has to work with. The window object represents the browser window. And so when you think of the browser window, one thing that I think of immediately when I think of the browser window and like how it relates to JavaScript, we've probably all been on websites where you got pop-ups, right? And so why do these pop-ups occur? You know, it depends on basically the JavaScript that was written, right? So pop-ups are typically a behavior of a website caused by the JavaScript. And so you can create a new browser window using the window object. And so that's one thing that you can do, is you can create a browser window. And a lot of times pop-ups, you know, they have different things, behaviors, I'll say. You know, sometimes a pop-up goes up on top of the other window, of the window that you're viewing. Sometimes a pop-up goes and it's like minimized. Sometimes it goes behind, so it's in front, behind, or minimized. And these are all behaviors that can be controlled with JavaScript. Sometimes that window is a full screen window. Sometimes it's got a certain width and a certain height. So you can control the window height with JavaScript. You can close windows, right? So you can use JavaScript to close a browser window or open new windows, right? So the window object is referred to as the global object. And I know I cover this. The book covers it. The global object simply means that when you have a method, you know, typically you say object name dot method name. And that's the convention in JavaScript. Object name dot method name. When you say, okay, well, the window object is a global object, that just means that you don't need to prefix window dot to the method names, right? So one example of that is alert and prompt. Alert and prompt belong to the window object, but you don't need to prefix window dot alert. It's just assumed. So if you just have a method that doesn't have an object that it's associated with, because it always will. Methods are associated with objects. Object dot method. So if you just got a method that's just called without the object, it can be safely assumed that it belongs to the window object. So that's what it means, the global object. Then you have the document object, and we've used that quite a bit. Document get element by ID, and there are many other methods. But you know, basically this document allows you to work with the document object model. The document object model is basically, and we'll get into this, but what is the document object model? It's a very key thing to JavaScript, understanding the DOM as it's referred to. Well, it's what is it? So the model is a picture. Okay, that's what a model is. A model is a picture. Okay, of the various objects that are loaded into memory, into your computer's memory, that represent the HTML document. So it's basically how JavaScript works with your HTML. in the sense of using various objects. I need to simplify that. That is too complex of an explanation, right? So the document object model, first off, again, I'm going to repeat this part because it's important. It's a picture. So when you picture it, it's literally, let's see if I can hop ahead. No, of course not. I think it's the next chapter where we dive deeper into the DOM. So for now, I won't dive deeper because I know we will do a deeper dive on the DOM. It's a picture of objects that represent how to work with HTML, the HTML document. Okay, then there's a navigator object, contains information about the browser. Why is that useful? Have you ever been to a website that says, for best support, to use this website, please stop using Internet Explorer version 6, right? That's JavaScript that can go into the client's browser, basically determine what version it is, not only what browser it is, but what version of that browser, right? So this is IE version 6, this is IE version 7, this is IE version 8. There's a lot of information that JavaScript can extract about who's actually using this website. So there are website statistics that can say, okay, well, 50% of the users are on Chrome and 30% are Internet Explorer, so on and so forth. And so JavaScript can, using this navigator object, get browser information. There's also history information. Your browser has a history, right? You can go view your browser's history in settings history. And to some extent, JavaScript can access that history and see, to some extent, where you've been specifically on your website, right? So cross-domain history isn't easily accessible with JavaScript, but specifically you could tell where users have been all throughout your website. So these are various objects that are in the browser. Okay, there's a whole other list here. I'm not going to go through this list in detail. There's an object called object, interestingly enough. There's an object called an array. You guys have seen this. When we created an array, one syntax, we would say, let variable name equals new array. And so we kind of learned arrays and how they were objects. You can create dates, you can create function objects, you can create number objects, strings, Boolean, and there's actually a math object that has a bunch of useful functions for doing some, as it says there, working with numbers. All right, so going through this, when you create a variable, as they do here, you might not realize it, but if we just look at this line right here, const pi equals 3.14, that variable is automatically, as it says there, it wraps a primitive number. The primitive number is just 3.14. That's just a piece of data. But in JavaScript, that piece of data is automatically, pi is going to be an object. Even though you don't see the keyword new. Typically, when you see the keyword new, that's how you know there's an object. In JavaScript, when you have something as simple as a variable that holds a number, that variable is automatically an object. What does that mean? Well, that means that you have methods that belong with that object that you can use. One of the methods that belong to a number object is TwoFixed. Right? So if we understand the number object and what are the various methods that it has, then we understand what kind of functions we can do with any one of our variables that just hold a number. Right? TwoFixed is one of those methods. Okay, so that's not always the case in different languages. sometimes you have a primitive number, that's all it is. It's just a number. There's no methods that are built into some languages that you can perform on numbers. But JavaScript, it's nice enough. Anytime you got a number, you've got some pre-built methods that you can use to work with that number. So some of the terms related to objects, object is just a representation of a thing. So a browser window can be an object. A HTML document can be an object. Heading element can be an object. There's lots of things that can be objects. It's a generic term for a thing. A property is a piece of data. A method is a behavior. A wrapper object, as we kind of described here, it basically converts a normal piece of data into an object. Utility object is something like math, where you've got like math.py. And that just means that that's something that's built in for a utility purpose in your code. It's got its own purpose. Native object is something that's just built into JavaScript. In other words, it's natively built into the code. And then there's a host object. You can create your own. So native versus host, the difference there being the objects that are native to the language versus you can create these things called classes, and through classes create objects. So a lot of terminology around objects. This is an example of using a confirm dialog box, and the main thing here, Windows, the global object, we've said that before. What that means is that you can use the confirm method that belongs to window without using the dot notation. You don't have to say window dot confirm. There's also some methods like parseInt and parseFloat that belong to window. Again, so you could just use these kind of out of the box. You don't have to use the dot notation. Now there are some very useful methods that we haven't covered yet. So this is new. So we'll go ahead and write a little bit of code using query selector and query selector all. So right now, we know how to get element by ID. So let's first assess what we know, and then let's add to it. We're going to use document get element by ID, then we'll use document query selector. So let me pop open my Visual Studio, and I'll go ahead and open a folder. This will be whatever, homework, chapter 4 homework. Okay, we'll write a little bit of JavaScript and a little bit of HTML. Button with an ID of button submit. And on click, we're going to call this function do something. Now, what we just did here is we wired an event handler, and what that means is this method, or function, there's a slight difference between method and function, but method and function are the same thing, with a slight difference. Methods typically are associated with objects, And so it's a behavior that's associated with an object. A function is not associated with an object. So this is just a function. It's a block of code that does something, but it's not associated with an object. Whereas a method is a block of code that does something that is associated with an object. So basically, they're both blocks of code that do something. It's just whether they're associated with an object or not. And so with this, I'll just write a little alert, and I would just say, "Hi, Mom," just to show that we are wiring up our function, our event handler. So this is typically called an event handler, which all an event handler is a function that runs on an event. So that is what we know so far. And so what we can do here is use getElementById. So we might have a variable called first name, and here's our getElementById. Text name dot value, and then, as you know, we'll do a paragraph ID of output. Inner HTML is first name. Okay, so very simple stuff. We've done this before. So I'll go ahead and type my name, click it, and it puts it in a paragraph. Again, what just happened there? The page refreshed. That's because my button is a submit button. If I don't want this to be a submit button, I have to, of course, give it a type of button. Now our button is not a submit button. When I put my name in there, it puts my name in the paragraph. Document getElementById. Okay, so this is what we know so far. However, let me go back to my PowerPoint. There is a method called querySelector and querySelector All. Okay, so let's look up the Mozilla Developer Network on querySelector. And this is actually a very useful method, because what it allows us to do, the document method querySelector returns the first element within the document that matches the specified selector or group of selector. And so this method leverages our CSS knowledge, and you can use CSS selectors in here. Instead of just selecting by ID, we can use querySelector. So here, let's use document.querySelector, and let's select the ID of text name. So if we remember our CSS, how would we have selected this text box in our CSS? We would have selected it by the ID of, with a hashtag, look at me, with the pound symbol, txt name. And so remembering all of our CSS knowledge, there's a lot of ways to select things in CSS, right? Classes and IDs and child selectors and descendant selectors, and oh my gosh, there's so many ways to select things. So querySelector is a very useful method that, instead of now just only being able to get things by ID, we can get things however we knew in CSS. So it's a very powerful function. Functionally, it works the same way, but now we can leverage our knowledge of CSS to select things in JavaScript differently. So probably one of my favorite parts of this chapter is now we know how to select things in JavaScript using our CSS knowledge. You know, we ran through that CSS course pretty quick, and most people were pretty confident with how to select things in CSS. And then we got into JavaScript and we learned get element by ID, and that was like a little bit of a learning curve. But now the difference between query selector and query selector all. Query selector all, well, what if we have, I want to inspect something here. We're going to learn about some breakpoints and some different troubleshooting tools the next chapter. So I haven't really inspected my JavaScript. Now, you'll notice there's two script tags. One of them says code injected by live server. So this extension by live server is not an interesting, this is the JavaScript that I wrote. And I'm not really able to put a breakpoint in this. So if I go to sources and go here, now I can put a breakpoint in. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to inspect the first name variable. So if I click me, and then again, this is kind of stuff that these different troubleshooting tools, all I'm really looking to do is over here now I could see the first name variable holds a string Evan. So what this troubleshooting tool allows me to do is inspect my JavaScript as it runs so that I can look at the variables and see the values that they have and show you that this variable called first name just holds a single string called Evan. The difference between query selector and query selector all then, why did I go through this whole example? Query selector selects one item. Query selector all then selects multiple items. And so what happens if I take the value property off of this? In this case, what I would be selecting would not be the value property of a text box. I would be selecting the entire text box. Okay, the entire text box has more than just a value. The text box has like a height and a width and these other attributes that come along with it. So not just selecting only the value, this would select the entire text box. And so now let me show you, if I leave the value off and I inspect this first name variable, what it looks like. So I'm putting my first name in here. I'm going to inspect. If I go to sources, I got my breakpoint in here. I click me, and when I go down one line, see first name, you can see this right here. Can everyone kind of see that? First name has just more, it's now, you can see it says node list 1. You know, a node is a single object in the DOM. And so we're not I guess we're not looking at, I guess the point is we're not looking at it at a value now, we're looking at a text box object. Okay, so it's different. Query selector all. Okay, how could we use query selector all? Well, query selector all would be, what if we have multiple items that we would want to select? It would actually return an array of objects. And so maybe, and I'm just winging this, right? So maybe I've got a few inputs, ID of text last name. So this will be text first name. This will be ID of text last name. And I'm going to put a class of input input box, right? So I'm going to put the same class on two of them. So this class and this class. Okay, so now we've got two text boxes that have the same class. Query selector all, I'm going to select the class of input box. Okay, and so what this does is this returns an array of text boxes. What could you do? Well, maybe with an array of text boxes, you change their background colors to red, right? So you've got all these text boxes, and you want to change all their background colors, right? So this will now be called names because it holds multiple pieces of information. So now it's multiple things, okay? And I'm just going to inspect this and just show you that this does look differently when we inspect. I click me, and now when I look at names, now you see the note list has two things in it, right? So that's the difference between query selector and query selector all. Query selector is meant for a single element. Query selector all, it would return multiple elements in an array. Yep.
So I was just going to say, so then that names would now be an array, right?
Names would be an array, and if you wanted to do something to each element in the array, you would loop through it. You would loop through that array and say, okay, for each element in the array, maybe you got 10 elements here. For each element in the array, change the background color. Or, you know, if you're doing input validation, for example, right? And they for each field that they left blank, you could load that up into a variable and loop through them and turn the background colors red. You forgot to put in the names, right? That kind of thing. But yes, it's an array, therefore you can loop through it and do whatever you got to do with it. So that's the difference between query selector and query selector all. Probably my favorite thing about this chapter. Close, close, close. Slide 12 demonstrates kind of what I just got done demonstrating, which is, you know, you can select things by ID. In this case, query selector all. They didn't select by a class, they just selected all the anchor tags. Keep in mind, you know, there's all the CSS selectors are now available to you. You might remember there were attribute selectors. And so you could select all of the anchor tags that have an attribute, an HTTP attribute, let me rephrase that. An href attribute that begin with HTTP. And so I've seen this kind of thing used before where it's like I'm selecting all of the external links because internal links, relative links, don't start with HTTP, right? So you select all the external links and then you load them up in your JavaScript and you do something with them. You give them classes, you remove classes. You know, there's still a lot of things that you can do in JavaScript that we haven't even gotten to. So it's like, first you got to learn to select things in HTML, then you learn what all is possible. We haven't learned all what's possible quite yet. Yep.
Is href a attribute that you can select in JavaScript?
Yeah, with this query selector. With this query selector, because there were in CSS, there were attribute selectors that you can now apply in the JavaScript. So what did they really do? Now we're selecting by IDs. We're selecting by element type. This is the anchor element and classes. So that's cool. Look, query selector all. Let's select all the H2s that are in the FAQ ID. And let's select all the paragraphs that are in the div. Right? This is just a normal CSS selector. Let's select all the divs with a class of closed. Again, returns an array. So that's, you know, query selector returns a single thing, query selector all returns an array. If you return an array, you typically got to loop over that array, which we learned. What was that loop that we learned yesterday that was good for? For in, yeah. you could use a for in loop to loop over one of these variables. Good stuff.
I'm sorry, could you go back? Yeah, that one.
Yep.
Sorry, pound sign FAQS H2.
Yep.
What is that selecting again?
That is selecting all of the H2s that are children of the FAQs div.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yep. So that's a descendant selector. Yep. Sam?
So basically, the whole point of a query selector is to be able to use CSS selectors.
Yeah. Yeah. Query selector is your CSS selectors. That's right. So if you liked CSS and you found CSS easy to learn, this should help you with that, right?
So then, like, what's something you can use that for, like a query selection? Like, I know you mentioned validation. Like,
Yeah. So all of what we kind of discussed this early on, but it's good to review it now. So why, what exactly are we going to wind up doing in using JavaScript for, right? So what is JavaScript commonly used for? One very common thing that JavaScript is used for is validation. Okay, so form validation is one very common use of JavaScript. Doing things like calculations, right, where you're reading maybe values of where someone lives, where they're shipping something to, doing some sort of math to calculate something. Image sliders is a very common thing, right? Using JavaScript for image sliders. Believe it or not, JavaScript is highly leveraged in Bootstrap for determining the width of your browser window and having some sort of responsive nature depending on the browser width. So JavaScript and what it can do, I understand, like right now we're just learning these very almost cheesy things that we're doing with it. It's not until you take what we're learning in this chapter plus what we're doing over the next couple of chapters to see, oh, okay, that's how you do an image slider with JavaScript, or oh, now I'm actually doing something useful with it, right? So a lot of different things. And in summary, those different things, quote unquote, those different things add interactivity and make the page dynamic.
so like these things will like make more sense once we like figure out what they're actually used for.
I mean, unless you just take the generic like calculators, validation, input sliders, animations are another thing that's commonly used with JavaScript. Yep.
Is there kind of an advantage of using the query selectors versus like the get element by ID?
Okay.
Can you kind of mix and match?
You can mix and match is correct. You can mix and match. Why would we use query selector over get element by ID? It goes back into HTML and CSS. Can you just give everything an ID? Yes, you could just give everything an ID. Is it more efficient to be able to select things in CSS without giving everything an ID? The answer is yes. Because if you give everything an ID, if you've got 100 elements and you're giving all 100 elements IDs, that's making your HTML file larger. When the HTML file is larger, it's slower to download. Where we left off, right around slide 15, and this can be covered pretty quick. We did talk about different objects, and so we know that there's a number object, we know there's a window object and a document object. There's a text box object, and you've worked with the text box object, specifically with the value. And so if you select a text box in your JavaScript, you use the dot value to read the information out of the text box. There's also a disabled property that's allowed you to enable and disable a text box. And so from the JavaScript, you can disable a text box. If you set the disabled property, it's Boolean, so true or false. Disabled to true would make that text box go gray, and you can no longer interact with the text box. Then there's a couple of methods. If you select the text box, you can focus the text box. And so as you can imagine, what the focus does is that puts that cursor blinking on that text box. And so that's really useful if you're doing form validation and there's an invalid piece of data that you want to put the focus on a text box. You could use this focus method. Yeah.
Is there a focus in HTML?
There is on when the page loads. And so you can focus a text box, on the page load. But this is more like as the user's been interacting and clicking around on the page, right? And then there's a select method, which will allow you to, instead of just focusing it, a select is literally like you highlight the information in the text box, right? So a focus just puts the cursor there. A select makes you actually select the data in the text box. Okay, so those are just some methods and properties of text boxes. And then another, if you have a number object, again, you've kind of seen this. You can trim the number of digits on a number using TwoFixed. That's the most useful piece of information there. You've kind of seen this before, how you can take a selector. So if you break it down, like I like doing this, this first line selects the text box itself. And I literally did that in my code where I selected just a text box. And then you select that variable, and since that's a text box now, this first name represents the text box, then you can read the dot value out of the text box and reassign it to first name. And so, why would you really do that? In reality, you'd put it all in one line, most likely. But this just does break it down. You can select a text box, and then you can work with those individual properties and methods. Or you chain it together. You say, okay, this is my selector. I'm going to chain the value property onto my selector. So we've already been chaining. We didn't know that was called chaining, but we've been chaining. Here's another example of chaining. Again, chaining just reduces the number of lines that we would have to write. So here we select something with an ID of sales amount. It's a text box. I know that because it's a dot value. We then reassign the sales amount to be the value that's in the text box, and then we parse it to a float. Because keep in mind, a text box is going to be a string by default, right? With chaining, we just go ahead and parse float the value. We've done this before, right? Now it's just starting to piece it together. Okay, the value belongs to a text box object. The parse float belongs to the window object. Like where all these pieces are coming from. Now we can maybe understand it a little better. TwoFixed comes from our number, right? So we're parsing float, which comes from window, the value, which comes from text box. It's a good example of chaining a bunch of pieces together, right?
So I'm kind of confused on what TwoFixed does.
Good question. So what does TwoFixed do? So if you've got like a decimal, like with 10 decimal points or 10 decimal places, TwoFixed, you can say TwoFixed 2, which will just basically chop it at 2 decimal places. Okay, it's not a rounding function, but a truncating function.
So then it wouldn't do anything.
It wouldn't show you any more than 2 decimal places. So if you're doing currency, you do TwoFixed 2, and you get that. Yep.
So a question with that, you always say it's like it rounds it. Does it actually round it, like mathematically, or does it just chop it?
Just chop it.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a rounding function. There is a built into JavaScript, and that belongs to math. There's different ways to round, but this TwoFixed does not round.
Okay.
It just chops, truncates, if you will. All right, slide 20. You've kind of seen slide 20 before, specifically when we learned arrays, how to declare arrays. We would have a variable declaration like const, and then the name of your variable equals new array. Well, the keyword new, anytime you see the keyword new in JavaScript and in other languages, that means we're creating an object. And then the object type parentheses, in that example, const today equals new date. The date with the parentheses, remember when you see parentheses, that's a method call. In that specific line, that's actually called a constructor. Okay, that date with parentheses there, that is a method call to a method called date. But a specific kind of method called the constructor. Again, we'll dive deeper into what constructors are probably in another class. But just FYI, that's where the constructor is. That line right there, date parenthesis, that's a constructor. All right. For now, just realize that's what you're doing. You're building a date object. Like, what is a constructor? It builds something. What does this constructor build? It builds a date. And then from there, you got a bunch of useful methods. Once you have a date object, you've got a bunch of useful methods that they all work a little bit differently. And I would encourage you to, what the heck? I can write a chunk of code. I can just mimic this. Const, NST, typo, new date, alert. Actually, let's just do document, get element by ID, output dot inner HTML. So when I do today dot, right away you could see there's a bunch of get dates. But if I go to to date string is one method. And let's save that. So when I click my button, it puts this format of a date. Where does that date come from? It comes from your system clock. Okay, so this is the format of to date string. Now, this constructor uses the system clock by default. You could use different things, but let's append that with some of these other methods. Get full year, get date, and get month. Well, you can probably guess what those do. So I'm going to append dot get full year, get month. I got to put line breaks here. There's my full year 2021. And now it's become, actually there's my get full year 2021. My month is 9. Why is it 9? We start at 0. Just to throw you off, but no, we do start at 0. It's October 26th, starting at 0. There we go. All right. So that's your dates. Boy, let me tell you, working with dates in the programming world is a complex topic. There's so many ways to work with dates, so many formats, to work with dates. We'll keep it surface level. Yes, sir.
Is there some way to do for time? Because sometimes you see some websites that have an active clock
Yeah.
and a date.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a time, to use the system clock for timer. Yeah. Get hours. Get minutes. So that's all built into the date.
Get milliseconds.
Get milliseconds. Yep, all built into date. Good question. All right, when we're working with strings, again, when you're working with strings, it's pretty common to want to substring, which means you got a big long string and you just want a piece of that string. That's what a substring is. It is a smaller piece of a bigger thing. And so if I go back to present this, let's just glance at this slide and then maybe we can write some some information. So if you've got a variable, that variable holds a string. I'll put const name equals Evan Gudmestead. Okay. Name dot length is the first thing they put on there. So I'll say document get element by ID output dot inner HTML equals name dot length. This is just going to be how many characters are in my name. It does include the space, right? A space is a character. So if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. If I counted that right, I click the button. I got 14. So that's the length property. If I do a 2 uppercase, let's do, well, again, a method is, it does something. Property is just a piece of information. So like doing something is going to take every character and convert it to uppercase. That's why there are parentheses. So that's name to uppercase. Index of, let's do that. Let's do index of the space. Name dot index of, I want to find the capital letter G. So that's going to be the position in the string with the first capital letter G. If there are multiple, it just returns the first. This is the 5th position. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So starting your count at 0, the index always starts at 0. So the capital letter G is the 5th position, the 5th character in that string. These are just very, again, working with strings in programming and being able to manipulate those strings to get it to do what you need it to do. Very important, very common tasks. And the last thing here, okay. So let's do, okay, good. First name, so here we go. We're gonna change the index of the space. So I'm gonna create a variable to get the const space index. Okay, so this variable is gonna be a number that holds the position of the space. Okay, so what I'm gonna do here is, here's my string, and I'm just going to extract my first name by using substring and saying, okay, I'm going to start const first name equals, and the slideshow has this, name dot substring. So name is your full name, dot sub str. It's kind of confusing, is that there's 2 substring methods. Okay, we're just going to focus on the first one. The first one has 2 pieces of information you need to provide: the start and the length. So we're going to start at character 0. That's the first character. And the length is going to be the number up until the space index. So what was space index? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is going to start at 0 and go for 4 characters. The first 4 characters are going to be E, V, 0, 1, 2, and 3, my first name. So let's just output that, right? Document, get on the... So it substrings my full name and just gives me my. You would have to then, if you just wanted the last name, do something similar, right? Get the index of the space, start the count at the next position, and go for however many characters are remaining in the string. So your length would have to be, some sort of math like minusing the first name. So like if the whole thing is 14 characters, you would have to subtract 5 characters off of that. You would go for 9 characters. So extracting the last name is a little bit more complicated than the first name, but definitely achievable. And that would be how I would approach that. There might be a different solution. Substrings, all these string methods, very useful stuff. Very useful stuff. Okay, these are all a bunch of terms that we've kind of been hitting on. Global object, document, text box number, a method versus function. Again, semantic, like whatever, small differences there. A date object, a string object, and a constructor. A constructor is a method that has the name of a class, but you know where it is when you see a constructor. Next, part of the challenge of learning JavaScript, I'm just standing up to stretch. Part of the challenge of learning JavaScript is like, how many different ways do we have to learn to do the same thing? And unfortunately, I don't know a solution to that. It's like, hey, we know how to make a function. And we know how to call that function. We got function do something. On click, you call do something. Okay, that's what this book calls a function declaration. Okay, and that's the easiest way that I know to create a function and call the function. Okay. There are advantages of learning another way of creating a function and calling that function. There's one thing that I would add to this before I move on. Okay, this is called a function declaration. That's, if you look at this slide, function declaration, that's what this is called. So I'll comment this called a function declaration. One thing we haven't talked about when it comes to functions, this is really important, basics. This is really, before we learn 3 different ways of doing the same thing, we have to learn what a parameter is. Okay? You have used parameters, like right here. This is a function call. This is a function call that you're passing some information into the function. Right? You can all see that. But if I didn't have anything here, and there are functions that just work like this, you just call the function, substring. Okay? So some functions require some information for them to work. Other functions don't. Okay? So these things inside of the parentheses are called parameters. These things inside of the parentheses are just called parameters. All they are pieces of data, numbers and maybe strings. They're just pieces of data that manipulate what the function does and what the function, the results of the function is, right? Because depending on these numbers, we get different data back from the function. So if I'm creating a function right now, my function called do something, there's nothing in the parentheses, right? This function declaration is creating a function. You're creating, that's what declaration means. Variable declaration, function declaration. You're creating a function. This particular function has no parameters. But maybe I want my function to be called add. And I want my function to have some parameters. So this would just be data 1, comma, data 2. What's interesting here, data 1 and data 2 are just variables. Typically, when you declare variables, don't you need a keyword? What keyword declares a variable? What keyword? Let or const. Those are the keywords to declare your variables. When you're declaring a variable that's a parameter, that's all a parameter is. It's a variable. It's a piece of data. Okay? It's just giving us a name called parameter because it's in the parentheses. It's just a variable that's in the parentheses. Okay? You don't need the keyword let or const here. Okay? And these variables are only inside of the function. That's the only place you could use them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do documents.get element by ID output.enter HTML. I'll do let sum equals data 1 plus data 2. Okay, so I'm just going to add these numbers together and I'm going to output them. Now that my function has parameters though, this is called the function call. Let me highlight the function call. You have to declare a function, you have to call the function. Those are the two parts. Declare the function, call the function. Declare the function, call the function. If you declare a function with no parameters, you can call it with no parameters. So this is calling it with no parameters. But now we have parameters. So when we call it, we have to give it the information that it needs. Yeah.
So you don't have to fill data 1 and data 2 into the on-click one?
Yeah, that's actually what we're going to do. That's exactly what we're going to do. So what are the two numbers that we're adding together? Let's just add 3 and 3. Yep.
Your function's wrong. For all input. You changed the name.
Yeah, I called it something. Now I called it add. So now I'm calling add and I'm passing in a couple pieces of information. Something's going on with my live server. It's just kind of going slow. It did this to me before. What are you doing, live server? There we go. See the results? So 6. So what are parameters? Number one, parameters are just variables. Okay? When you declare these variables though, there's no let or const. You just give them variable names. Variable names, you know the rules for variables, right? Variables you have rules. Like you can't name them anything you want. But practically anything you want. Okay, I just called mine data 1 and data 2. You could call it I1 and I2. You could call it pizza 1, pizza 2. Okay? When your function has parameters and you call the function, you have to pass data into the parameters. Right? So this data here, 3 and 3, is going to be, this first 3 is passed into data 1, the second 3 is passed into data 2. Okay, it is order. So if I say 3 comma 5, data 1 is 3 and data 2 is 5. So the order of the parameters matters.
So can you just keep putting information into it?
You could just keep doing that. Yeah, there's no, so parameters are optional. Like you don't have to have parameters. But there's no, I don't know of an upper limit of number of parameters. Like you could have 10 parameters if you want. Yep.
Okay, so how do you get those numbers in there? Like, would you have to have already coded them in there, or you know what I mean? Like,
Probably you're getting input from the user.
right.
And you would do that. So, okay, so here we said on click. Let's do this. So on click, I'll just call a function called read. Okay, so let's make a function called read. Okay, that I'm going to change this from text first name. This is okay, text number 1, text number 2. So we're just going to be adding the two numbers together from the user, right? So I'm going to read text number 1 dot value into input 1. Make another variable called input 2. Now, inside of my function, I'm going to call add. See that? So one function can call another function. And so instead of just statically hard coding the numbers, I can get
No, that makes sense.
And then because you click read,
because you click read runs and calls add, then add runs.
And it doesn't matter that the read is below the add because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, what happens is that this will load top to bottom. Basically, these functions will be understood by the JavaScript interpreter and run when they're called. So now this, why did that do that? Concatenation. So we would do something like a parse float here. This is an overly, you don't, just to add two numbers together, you obviously don't have to do this. You don't have to do this, but what this does demonstrate is what a, I mean, if you follow the flow here, what a parameter is. If you follow the flow, on click we call read. Read gets these two values and stores them in variables, input 1 and input 2. Input 1 and 2 are then passed into data 1 and data 2. So the values are passed from here into here. So data 1 and data 2 essentially hold the values out of the text box. You get a sum and you put that sum on the screen. The scenario is more complex than it needs to be for the sake of just demonstrating a parameter. Okay, what a parameter is a piece of information or multiple pieces of information that a function can use to do what it needs to do. I'll hang out here for a minute because okay. I'm going to take this whole read thing out because this was a little bit shorter and quicker to understand. So I don't know if that read might have thrown people off, but function declaration is how we call the this on click wired an event, a click event, to a function call. So this piece right here is wiring an event to a function call. I'm going to make, so let me go back to the slideshow. Let's look at this and let's see if we understand this a little bit better now. So here's a function declaration. The function is called showYear. This function has no parameters. And so when you call the function, you call it without parameters. This slide It's a little funny because the function name is a $sign. The name of this function is literally, the name of this function is show year. The name of this function is the $sign symbol. That is a legal identifier. You notice this function at the top, it takes one parameter. That parameter is a variable called selector. This function has a keyword return, which we haven't necessarily said what a return does, but a return sends information back to wherever that function was called. Let me explain return real quick. Let me go back. I'm just going to, and I can always redo. Let me explain what return does. If I bring back my old code, we actually, if everyone, let's look at this line. Let's just look at this line right here. Did everyone understand this line when I wrote it? More or less? This line reads the name variable and gives me the number, the position of the space. What is the position of the space? The index of the space. If E is 0, V is 1, A 2, N is 3, the space was position 4. So this space index holds the value of 4. See, a function can just do something. Like if you think of my add function, it just did something, which adds some numbers together and then it outputted. That's what my function did. Some functions just do stuff. They just perform an operation and that's it. Some functions perform an operation and then send information back to wherever the function was called. Index of sends a number back so that you could assign that number equal to a variable. So again, functions operate, what we're learning here is you can take inputs to a function optionally. You with me? What are those inputs called? What are inputs to a function called? Starts with the letter P. A different letter P, a different P word. Parameters. Think of parameters as inputs.
Okay, so the parameters go into the function, right? Function.
Yeah, they go into the parentheses.
Okay.
So parameters are in the parentheses. Think of parameters as inputs. Do you have to have parameters? No, you don't have to have parameters. They're optional. You could have 0 parameters or you could have 5 or 10 or whatever you need. Okay? Methods can also optionally output things with the keyword return. So you can have 0 or many inputs with parameters. You could have 0 or 1 output. That output is done with the return keyword. And this is an example of a method that returns a piece of information. You understood that this returns a number and it stores it in a variable. So this method has a return keyword in it. Whoever wrote this method basically counts, it's looking for that space. As soon as it finds that space, it returns the position of that space. So that's what the return keyword does. So if you, again, in summary here, methods are just blocks of code. Methods are just blocks of code. Functions are just blocks of code. Use those interchangeably here, method, function. They're just blocks of code. They could take optional inputs and they have optional outputs. The inputs are called parameters. You can have 0 or many parameters. The outputs are just done with the return keyword. And you don't have to return, But optionally, you can return 0 or 1. So parameters are 0 or many. Outputs are 0 or 1. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so what's the difference between having the variables in the parameters and then just like stating them inside the function? Is there really like any difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The question is asked is, hey, you know, why not just read the data when you need to read it in the function into your variables versus letting the user so it comes down to like this takes one parameter. And so you don't know that parameter, you don't know the value here when you're coding the method. You want to let the developer in that sense tell you the information that's needed. So that's when you use parameters, when you want to let the developer say, hey, what are you looking for? You're looking for a space. Because you would have no way of coding that input beforehand in the method, right?
Okay.
You would have no way of knowing that. So parameters are really useful when you just don't know the values that are going to be provided. Okay. A lot of new stuff there. A lot of new stuff there. Functions. These are all called function declarations. Functions have inputs. Those inputs are called parameters. You don't have to have parameters, but you can have many. 0 or many parameters. The outputs are done optionally. You could have 0 returned or 1 returned. Like this index of, it only returns one piece of information. It doesn't return like 5 numbers. It just returns 1 number. So when I go back to the slideshow, this return keyword returns 1 piece of information. We could break down what is actually going on here. This $ function is something this book does. It is something I'm not a big fan of, so I'm going to gloss over that. Okay, so what is, here we got here, function declaration. These 2 variables are called what? Parameters. These are our 2 parameters. What does this function do? It calculates some sort of tax and then sends that number back to wherever this function is called. So this tax is going to be returned so that you can then store that tax in a variable whenever you call this function. Keep in mind, this is just creating the function. When you call the function, then you would have to create some sort of variable like something like this. We would say const tax equals calculate tax. The first is the subtotal, $100 subtotal, and then the tax rate is a 0.075, 7.5% tax. So this function calculate tax returns the amount of tax. I can then call this function. This would be an example of calling that function, giving it the inputs that it needs, and then getting back the output. The inputs are called parameters. The output is done with the return keyword.
Would a return like put it back into the text box that you?
Well, you notice, see, here's the function call to the right. So where does the return go to? In this case, the return is going into the variable. So that the result of that math is being stored ultimately here in this text. What could you do with that? You could put it in a text box, you could put it in a database, you could put it in a paragraph, whatever you want. let's go ahead and take another break. We'll take another short minute break. Just take 5 minutes. I think before we left off, we kind of left off like this. The only thing that I've added on my function declaration, I made this, but you guys should understand this, right? I made a function called calculate tax. It had two, what are these called? Two parameters, two inputs. Two inputs, and it has one output, right? What do I do with that output? I just pop it up on the screen. You notice on my click, I'm now just doing an alert. So the data that gets sent back, it gets sent back to right here, and I just pop it open in an alert. Okay, so everyone's with me on this, right? So what are my inputs? I input 107.5%. So the 100 goes to subtotal, the 7.5% gets into tax rate. I do some math, and I return the results of that math. That will ultimately pop up on an alert box. This is one way of creating or declaring a function. It's called a function declaration. It's the easiest way of creating a function with parameters. I don't have any inputs, but you notice the output is correct. Yep.
So, with the numbers and the offset, are those just like set values that are, or is there like ways to change those? Like
Yeah, you could change these. You could read from a text box, and then put those into the method, as I demonstrated with the read function before, right? So these are called literal values that are coded, the 100 and the 0.075. Anytime you have values that are encoded into your code is called a literal. And so 100 and 0.075 are literal values, but you could just get your values from a text box. You know how that would, well, I don't want to go down that path, but we did that, right? We did that with the read function, and you kind of go back and see how that worked. One function called another function and passed the values from one to the other. But to answer your question, yes. In a real world scenario, you would not code literal values here, okay? There's a second way to declare a function that's called a function expression. Look at this. This function expression functionally does the same thing, operates the same exact way. In fact, you notice I don't even change the call. It has two parameters. Here's our two parameters. The function name is declared calculate tax. This is the one we're going to use the least amount in the class, but this is another syntax, if you will, for creating a function. It's a little strange to look at, but I guess it's all strange to look at when you're learning. So functionally, though, just checking this out, it's called a function expression. Whatever, it works the same way.
What's the difference up there?
Your expression is a constant variable.
Yeah, so the function name here is still calculate tax. There's no functional difference, just a syntax difference. There's no functional difference. Here's a third way of doing it. Don't hate me. I didn't make this stuff up. This one's called an arrow function. Very similar to the function expression, except for they got this additional arrow. Literally is practically the same. Instead of the word function, we got this arrow here. So there's no word function. It's just this arrow. So we remove the word function. These are our parameters. So const calculate tax equals parameters, arrow, block of code. Functionally, same thing.
So why would you use the first one? Why would you use the first one, or why would you use the arrow one? What makes them?
So as it turns out, there's a lot of things in JavaScript that are moving towards this arrow function. So this is considered the modern approach. There's probably a deeper explanation, but I don't have it off the top of my head. So let me see if I can find a little bit deeper explanation. To be honest with you, though, but like my understanding, and I've been studying JavaScript for a long time. For a long time, I was just doing this, and I was totally cool doing this. And then they said, okay, well, here's another way of doing it. And it's like, okay, I guess if I have to, because other people do it this way, so I learned this other way. And then now, within recent years, is the arrow function. So it's like, why? To the best of my knowledge, is because it's changed and updated and evolved. I'm sure there's a deeper reason.
Doesn't seem like there's less typing involved.
It doesn't seem like there's less typing. You would think that the one advantage would be less typing. Now, I have used these arrow functions in other languages, and I would say that they do offer like a condensed syntax, but not really here. The syntax is not condensed. But I will say in other languages, and even next semester, we'll use these arrow functions, and it will be a condensed syntax. All right. The other thing that I'm going to introduce now that I've introduced these arrow functions, so like all three of these things are doing the same thing. You're creating a function and then you're calling a function. All three of these things do the same thing. They create the function. We call the function the exact same way. This piece right here, on click, this on click wires the function to the event. The event is click. The function is calculate tax. So when you have a function that runs in response to an event, it's called an event handler. I'm going to repeat that. When you have a function that responds to an event, it's called an event handler. An event handler is just a function that runs in response to an event. This on click is also a dated way of wiring up an event to an event handler. So I'm going to show you the updated way and the way we will do in this class. And this I do know the advantage of. Why? In fact, this on click was practically dead for a while. No one used this for a while until React. Oddly enough, this React library that we're going to learn, React.js, I said we're going to do that as part of this class. This on click, this way of wiring events was practically gone until React. React brought it back. So how then do we wire our events to our buttons? So these three things, creating the function. We have a function called calculate tax. Let's wire our events to an event handler. The event handler is just a function, this guy here. Okay? Instead of saying on click, here's the syntax to do that. And this is the syntax that we're going to use in this class. Let's get element by ID. Let's get our button. What's our button? Button submit. Button submit. The secret sauce here is add event listener. The click event, comma, the name of the function. Calculate tax. Now, I'm going to do this without parameters first. Because this is not going to work, because this does not have parameters. This does have parameters. So if I fire this up, instead of returning anything here, I'm just going to alert the tax right here. So if this see, we don't have the right math. So this works. We have wired our event, the event being the click event, to a function call using this add event listener. Okay, now we just have to get the data, and I don't think this is correct, but let's just pass the 100.075 right here. I don't think that's correct. It is. Okay. Actually, is it happening on? It's not quite correct, because you notice what's happening? It's doing on page load, not on the click. So that's not correct. Momentarily, let me glance at this. Yes, sir.
Mine is doing it on a click, but then it pops up like 2 more boxes. So I don't know if that's something.
Yep. So we're jumping ahead here in our lecture. See, here's exactly what we did, but we don't have it with parameters. Correct. So here, let's take the parameters out. Okay. Without parameters, notice we took the parameters out here, called calculate tax, at which point we would get the text amount, input with an ID of tax rate. Okay. Let's do it this way, and this kind of brings it back to what Josh was asking, is why don't you just do it in the function, right? So here's our calculate tax. We're not going to use parameters. Let's go ahead and say let amount get element by ID text amount dot value. So I've got one text box called text amount. I've got another one called tax rate. Let rate equals document dot get element by ID text rate dot value, and then I'll do an output here, document get element by ID output dot enter HTML equals amount times rate. How about that? And then we'll just do our output. So this will be a working example. Forgive my blunders earlier, but this should work. And that is, here's our function call. Here's our event, wiring the event using add event listener. Why are we learning this? Well, with add event listener, you can also remove event listener. So sometimes you might click the button and it calls one function. Other times you might click the button, it could call a different function. And so this is a more dynamic way of responding to events. At some point during the execution of your page, doing this event might do one thing. At other times during the execution of your page, doing the event would do something else. So wiring up your events this way, there is an add event listener. You know, you might do this once you calculate tax once, and then you remove the event listener. You know, you could in fact do. Let's run this, make sure it works, and then I'll add to it. So again, if I say 200 at 0.075, cannot read property of null tax rate dot value txt rate. Oh, it's tax rate. You just saw a little bit of troubleshooting there, right? Let's reload that. My IDs were incorrect. Let's load that. Say 200.075, we get $15. Sounds right? 750, double that, yep, 15 bucks. So if there were like, you know, a good moment to kind of zone back in, you know, what have we done, you know, before our last break? We used this function declaration, and we had an on-click attribute that did the event wiring. Okay, since we've come back from break, we said, okay, well, we're going to use this arrow function instead of the function declaration, and we're going to wire our events with add event listener. So those pieces right there covered quite a bit of slide ground. Let's bring it back into this. Okay, so we had function declarations. This is function expressions. This is an arrow function. They kind of show here an arrow function with no parameters. An arrow function with one parameters. Notice this arrow function at the bottom here has two parameters and it's in parentheses. But an arrow function with one parameter does not have parentheses. With no parameters is empty parentheses, so that's just kind of unique. This slide right here goes into a little bit of detail why let is preferable over var. Remember early on we learned that you can declare a variable with var or with let, and we said that let's preferable. If you use var, that variable's scope, it actually attaches that variable to the window object. Whereas if you use tax, it does not. The reason why you don't want to do that is because the window object has its own methods and has its own properties. And so you see here, tax rate actually becomes a property of the window object. And if there are already a tax rate defined, then it would cause a conflict, right? So that's why it's considered better to use let over var, right? So long story short, use let, don't use var. VAR can lead to potential conflicts. Why are these variables declared global? They're declared, why are they known as global? Because they're declared outside of a function. When you have variables that are declared outside of a function, they're automatically known as global. What that really means is that even if you have different script tags, those variables are accessible across the different script tags and in all the different functions in those different script tags. A local variable, though, a local variable is only accessible to that block of code. And so when you're looking at this slide, it says a function that uses local variables and constants. Subtotal and tax rate right here, subtotal and tax rate, these are called parameters. And these parameters are known as local variables, meaning you can only work with them inside of this function. Same thing with tax. Tax is declared inside of calculate tax. It's only accessible inside of this function. So global variables are global across all the scripts. Local variables and local constants are only accessible inside of a function. Same thing in your for loops, you want to use let over var. Why would you want to use let over var? It's all dealing with scope. You only want your variables to have the minimal amount of accessibility as they need. And so you want variables to go in scope and out of scope as quickly as possible. When you say for let j equals 0, j is only accessible inside of this for loop. Therefore, you can kind of see why does this say j is not in scope, is because this for loop ends at the end of this curly brace right here. They put it all on the same line. This I is accessible to the function level. So basically var I is accessible everywhere inside of the function. So it is accessible outside of the for loop. So general rules of thumb here, just use let over var. This goes into explanations as to why you want to use let over var. And it mainly has to do with scope. Scope is the short answer, but it does get more complicated than that. Let's see. Let's look at some different events. So we know the click event, right? So the element, like a paragraph, you could do a click event on a paragraph. You could do a click event on anything, right? A list. You could do a double click. You could do a mouse over an image, a mouse out of an image. So mouse in and mouse out versus mouse over. Mouse in fires one time as soon as your mouse goes in. Mouse out fires one time as soon as your mouse goes out. Mouse over is like it's going to continually run. As long as your mouse is moving over the top of something, mouse over will continually fire. So mouse in happens once on the way in, mouse out happens once on the way out. Mouse over, as long as you're mousing over the image, it will continue to run. These controls are going to be like your form controls. So like a text box has focus, a text box has blur. A text box can change. So the value inside of a text box can change. You can run an event. as the user is typing in a text box, every key stroke is changing what's in the text box. You can fire events. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the changes like when they do the predictive text or
Yeah, I mean, think of Google. Think of Google, right? So you're typing in Google, every character stroke, it's giving you new suggestions. That's an event that's firing on change. That's exactly right. You select an item in a drop-down list, right? So the select event. These are all when you can run JavaScript code. These are all different events. When the browser window loads versus the DOM content loaded, two very different things. So the window load event is as soon as that browser window is open. The DOM content loaded is as soon as all the images download, the videos download, right? In other words, are you waiting for the HTML to finish loading? That's DOM content loaded. So a lot of times before you run JavaScript, you want to run JavaScript when the page loads, not when the window loads, but when the DOM content loads. There's a big difference between those two. Right, this is just using add event listener. We saw how to do that. So this is adding an event listener to whenever the DOM content loads. So that's our event. You're waiting for all the HTML to download and be ready to be manipulated. That's when we call this show message that basically is an alert that says the DOM is ready. The HTML is downloaded. There's one more layer of extraction that's actually pretty good here. Notice the difference between this line right here where my mouse is. Notice you're calling this show message as soon as this event runs. This is a function that has a name. Functions without a name are just called anonymous functions. An anonymous function is just a block of code that doesn't have a name. And so if you didn't want to or didn't need to create this function like they did here with this arrow function, you could just run an anonymous method as soon as this event happens, you run this code. And so let me show you what that might look like. This is my arrow function right here. Instead of calling this function, like if I didn't want to create this function as I have, I'm going to put another arrow here. Curly braces. And then I'm just going to put this logic right here. Then I don't need to declare this arrow function. So this is just an anonymous function that says, hey, when you do this click event, run this code. You don't need to declare a function. Just run this code when you click this button. Let's let this do its thing. Why this gets hung up, I don't know. Come on, come on. Wake up. There you go. Yeah. So this actually simplifies this even down a little bit more. So where, you just want to do something when the event occurs. Target the element, add event listener, put the event in there. This is called the event object. So you put a comma and then the event object. This gives us some information about, about the event. Oh, the user pressed a key. What key did they press? Oh, they clicked it. Was it a left click, a right click, a center button click? This event object can be used to give us more details about the event. So this is a very useful feature called an anonymous function, a function without a name. So let's do another. So this would be document dot add event listener. So notice we're not targeting anything. This is just on the HTML document. We're adding an event listener called DOM content loaded, capital DOM CONTNT loaded, comma, parentheses, EVT, arrow, curlies, semicolon here, alert, HTML downloaded, HTML images, videos, CSS. Typically that's what you want. That's when you want to, if you're going to run JavaScript when the page loads, it's typically after everything's been downloaded, because that's what you're manipulating. See, there you go. So that runs that. This is just live server glitching out. I don't know what the deal is with that. See, that's weird. So that's actually, again, there's a difference between when the browser loads and when the HTML finishes downloading. On this one, we're adding an event listener to the button. On this one, we're adding an event listener directly to the HTML document. It says, hey, whenever you're finished downloading, do whatever you got to do. Yep.
Could you just add like a time limit, or say like a timer
Yep.
or something?
Yep. We're going to add timers in a couple chapters. We'll learn timers. Yep. It's like, how do you wait 10 seconds after the downloads? I'm sure you've seen that, right? You go to a page and like you're just sitting there and all of a sudden you get like a little window pop, like a little chat box in the corner. Do you need help? Right? Why'd that take 10 seconds to show up? You know, probably JavaScript causing that little window to pop up. I know how foreign this is right now. I know how foreign this is right now. And I know that we've been lecturing all day. So I know all the challenges that I'm throwing at you right now. But again, you're seeing this stuff for the first time. Do your best. Tomorrow's a lab. We're going to get some good practice with this. You'll be feeling better. And I'm going to put this lecture on YouTube as if watching it one time wasn't painful enough.
Don't say that.
Yeah. So it is pretty typical, and this is good. So let's see. It's pretty typical to wait for the DOM to finish downloading before this is where we actually will attach our event handlers. So instead of putting our event handlers, notice before, this is just hanging out in the script tag. That doesn't always work because not all the HTML might be downloaded. Maybe it works here because all of our HTML gets downloaded first, but it doesn't always work because sometimes everything's not finished downloading. So to make sure that everything's downloaded before you attach your event handlers, typically, instead of doing it out in the open in the script tag, typically we're going to wire our event handlers inside of this DOM content loaded. So once the DOM is finished downloading, then we'll attach our event handlers. And notice the nesting syntax of this, right? So this line of code, this code is inside of that block. So that's, if we look here, here's our DOM content loaded, and inside of that, they're attaching a click event with an anonymous function that does whatever it needs to do. This event object, typically what it can be used for, some things have default behaviors, like, for example, links. You ever click a link and it says, you must be 18 to enter, kind of thing. It doesn't navigate to the link right away, but instead it gives you a little warning. Are you sure you want to navigate to this link? I mean, most people are just going to say yes anyways. But typically what that means is you're going to use JavaScript and it'll stop the default behavior of the link. The default behavior of the link is to navigate to that page. You know that. You click a link, it goes to the page. This method right here, prevent default, can stop the navigation of going to that page. Ask the user, are you sure you want to do that? Are you, 18 or older or what have you? And then determine whether the user actually goes to that page or not. Maybe you ask them their birth date. If they don't give you the right answer, then you navigate them to a different page. So you can use JavaScript to navigate them to page A or page B. They click on the link, you use JavaScript to determine where they go. Anchor tags have default inputs. Submit buttons, input type of submit has a default behavior. Input type of reset has a behavior. These are all behaviors that could be prevented. Right, and this is what that looks like. You got this event object, and then you would prevent the default behavior, evt.preventDefault. Okay, cool stuff. So that's the end of that lecture. We are going to do some labs tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and stop this.